Hey there, this is Michelle Prince, and I want to talk about sound bites and what that really means to you as a guest on a podcast and why this is so important. Well, what is really a sound bite? It's a lost art. It's have you ever wondered on a news channel why some reporters who may have interviewed multiple people for the same story, why they selected some people to be highlighted on the 10 o'clock news and not others? I guarantee it has a lot to do with sound bites, because sound bites are taking their short, succinct information that clearly defines the point you're trying to make in a very short period of time. Why is this so important as a podcast guest? Well, we're so excited as guests on a podcast, right? We're so excited we have this opportunity. We have a story to tell, and we can't wait to share, right, what we want to share on this podcast. But when you think about being a great guest, there's really a lot more to it than just telling our story. And you really have to be thinking about, what is the host wanting to get out of the show, as well as what are you trying to get out of the show, and how can you help that the host, look really good? Well, one of the ways I know is sound bites. Think of sound bites as you're selling the sizzle and not really the steak. So instead of explaining something in a really long, drawn out way, which is easy to do at times, it's taking that concept and just pulling it all together. I have my own podcast. I am a guest, but I also have my own podcast. And I will say the guests that I appreciate the most, the ones that I want to talk to again, or maybe invite back again, are the ones who know how to be a good guest. They know how to answer a question very succinctly. They know that there's plenty of other questions coming their way. So they're not going to spend the first 5 minutes just answering one question. I'll give you an example. Many times on a podcast, if you're a guest, the first question will be, so tell me about yourself. Tell me about your business. And of course, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much to tell. Where do I start? Well, start with the end in mind. What are you getting on that podcast for? What is the purpose? What do you want someone who listens to this to walk away with? That's the first thing they're going to hear. So you have to be very, very clear on what that message is, but then saying in a way that makes people want to listen. We've all heard podcasts before, and we've all heard people that just go on and on and on and on and on, when they really could have made that point in a couple of seconds, or at the very least, maybe a minute. So a soundbite is really just taking the thought, like I said, and bringing it together in a short, succinct way that keeps the listener's attention. And that's super, super important. The other thing is, it makes it easy for editing. If you think about a soundbite, it's a very clear start and a very clear finish. If somebody asks you a question, so how many years have you been in business? I've been in business for the last 15 years, and I'm excited about the next season, or something like that, whatever the soundbite is. It's the tone of voice also tells them you're starting, and it should also tell them when you're finishing. So be very clear about that. The reason a soundbite is important is an editor needs to know, especially in video or on podcasts, what's the end of that thought. And going back to my example on the newscast, for news reporters, they're looking for sound bites because they're doing these little promos. They're trying to tease you with what to watch on the evening news. And in fact, we're doing this all over the internet, really, on Reels and all of the short videos that you see. It's enticing you to want to come and listen for more. So that soundbite makes it really easy to just put that out there as just that one thought. So I help people tell their stories. One of my sound bites, I have many, but depending on what the question is when somebody says, well, why should somebody tell their story? I'll say, everyone has a story, and every story matters, but only if you tell it. That's a sound bite. It's short, it's succinct. It captures pretty much 5 minutes worth of what I would tell you of why you should write a book, but I brought it down into one comment of your story matters. So that's just some examples of why to do that. But it's easy for editing, but it also, for you as a guest, it makes you look prepared, because somebody who knows their message and they have total clarity on what their business is, what their book is about, what they're trying to accomplish, they're able to talk in these shorter sound bites. Somebody who's not really clear tends to ramble. And again, that is a nightmare for a podcast host. So it's really important to get good at that. So let me give you a few tips. I will say here, I am no expert. I am not a media guru, but I have learned by being on both sides of the mic as a host, as well as a guest, what works. And I do know sound bites work. And if you can get good at this and practice this, you will stand out on your podcast interviews. Number one, and I've said this a couple of times already, but it's worth repeating, it must be short and clear and to the point. What do I mean by short? Really, think about 3 seconds. What is something that you could say in a couple of seconds that can really capture the essence of what you do? If you don't know it, then now is the time to sit down and start working on that. You know, if you think about in speaking, if you get a speaking engagement, you may have an hour to articulate your message. Well, on a podcast, you don't, and especially when there's multiple questions to be asked. So how can you articulate your message in such a short, powerful way that is clear and it makes your point? And if you don't know it, that's something to practice, which leads to my second point, and it is all about practice, practice, practice. But it goes beyond just practicing and, you know, on a video for yourself. Is preparation is what makes practice make perfect. So preparing. Who is the audience? Who is, first of all, who is your audience? Who do you help the most? And what is your core message? You know, we think we know what this is many times, but if we can't articulate it, kind of like that, we've all heard of the elevator speech. If you can't really stand up and say what you do in 15 seconds or less, you probably don't have full clarity. So that's really something I'd suggest doing. But being able to do it in a way that is clearly speaking to the people you want to help most, right? It's not going to be just for anybody listening. It's going to be for the people that are going to be your niched market. And when you speak in sound bites to the people that you most want to help, they're the ones who may hear you and others might not. But it's just really important. But you can't do that unless you have clarity on your core message and the audience. And I'll add the purpose of why are you even a guest? I know it's fun to be on a podcast. We know it helps with our marketing, but really have a purpose and prepare and practice for that when you're getting ready for the show. It makes such a big difference. But also, you need to know the audience of the podcast host, because you can have a message prepared. You can be great at sound bites, but if the sound bites aren't geared toward the listener, it's going to go on deaf ears. So be very, very clear and know who the audience is of the guest or the host you're serving by being on their show, but also knowing your message and how your offering and your service can help their listener. At the end of the day, being a guest on a show is about the listener and really no one else. But it is an opportunity for us if we speak in sound bites that are clear and to the point. Okay, the other tip I'll give is repeat questions. I know that might sound silly because we're all listening and everyone heard the question that was asked. So why do we repeat a question? Well, the reason we repeat a question is it creates a soundbite. Let's say somebody needs a short, 5-second clip as a promo. If the host has asked you a question, and that took about 10 seconds or so to ask that question, and then you go immediately into the answer, what happens if they cut that clip just of you? People might not know what answer or what question you're answering. So always repeat that question when someone says, how did you get started in business? Well, I got started in business about 10 years ago. You see what I'm saying? So it prepares the perfect sound bite, which is a start to finish clear message that can be cut and edited out or used somewhere for that purpose. But it also repeats and it makes everyone, the host know that you're listening too. But the main purpose is that you want to have that perfect sound bite that includes the question and the answered very quickly. The other tip is don't be boring. Sometimes when we get all caught up in being on a podcast, we're so excited, but we're also thinking about, I have to do a soundbite and I have to do this and I have to answer. At the end of the day, be you, be authentic, but tone of voice is incredibly important for a couple of reasons, and especially for sound bites. When you work on your voice inflection, it is very, very clear when you're in the middle of a conversation and also very clear when you've finished the statement. You see how because of my tone of voice and the speed of which I spoke, you knew when I was in the middle of saying something and I wasn't about to start anytime soon. But then when I was wrapping it all up, you bring it all together, your tone of voice changes, and it becomes clear to the host that you are now done speaking. And that is also really important because to the host, they need to know when they're ready to go on to the next question. There's nothing worse than when, and I've done this before as a host. In fact, I did it this week where I interrupted someone who was answering a question a little too long than they probably should. I thought they were done. I started to ask a question and we interrupted each other because they weren't very clear in their tone. I didn't know if they were getting to the end of it. So not just don't be boring, in enthusiasm in your voice and all that, but be thinking about the close and using that close as a signal to the host that you're done answering that question. And also that it's a final comment, or I'm sorry, it's a final thought. So bringing it back to the beginning, a soundbite is clearly, it's a technique used in media. But it actually started, I think it was in the 70s in the presidential elections, where it was asked of them, well, what's your last comments? Like, if you had to wrap it all up in one, what do you stand for? That is a soundbite. And that's what they now call them in media. But a soundbite is the ability for you to have authority, because a person who speaks in soundbites, who respects the host, who says what they need to say, they get to the point and move on. It shows your professionalism, it shows your authority, it shows your clarity on your topic and your content, and it also shows that you prepared. So those are just a couple of tips, but being a guest on a podcast is such an incredible opportunity, but be aware that they want to hear from you, but keep it short, to the point, and make them look good. Hope that helps. Have a great one.